Hi guys, welcome to the next episode of our podcast. So we again are focusing on history and trying to find references to the today and today we will focus on the 14th century and we kind of will look into the pandemic type of living. And imagine that the pandemic is nothing new to the humanity. And the guys here will talk about the Black Death and what happened in the 14th century and how can we reference it to what is happening today.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
Well, let's start with a simple question. Why? Why the 14th century?
Basically, in history, 14th century is regarded as a calamitous century. There are many different reasons to call it that way, starting with little ice age, when temperatures drop around the world for the next 200, 300 years, which affects farming. So generally, there are difficulty in farming, which causes famines in the beginning of 14th century. Then we have 100 Years' War, which starts in 1337, goes over 15th century, but basically the two main countries in Europe, France and England, are engaged in constant war. Then we have, of course, Black Death, as you mentioned. We have the so-called pestilence that comes from Asia and affects countries all over the world as well. So in Europe, it's 1347 to 1351, 52 in some countries. So it's in the middle of 14th century as well. Then we have this population drop, significant population drop. We will talk about it later on. Avignon papacy. So we have difficulties in the church, where we have anti-popes in France or in Italy. Basically war between papacy and French kings.
It's a very eventful century.
Very eventful century.
There's a lot of political turmoil, and on top of that, we get all the medical issues that Black Death caused and population crisis and stuff like that.
Yeah. So inspiration for this podcast came from Barbara Tuchman's book called Distant Mirror, which has the same concept we are using at the moment, where you compare 14th century to, actually she wrote that book in 1970s, but what she was trying to achieve is to see similarities and differences in coping with, let's say, apocalyptic times. She's a very famous American historian. Book is not easy, it's over 700 pages. It's very difficult to go through, but it's I think it's one of the best accounts of 14th century I came across.
I mean, obviously, I believe that a Black Death pandemic would have been way worse than the one that we're facing now. But we can definitely draw some conclusions in terms of how the populations reacted and how the political powers reacted to it and stuff like that. So,
yeah, we can see the similarities between pandemic in 14th century and things that we see now. So the main similarity is that it's kind of great equalizer. So there's no discrimination in terms of social strata. So it affects all from noblemen to peasants, basically. So all social groups. That's one similarity. Just exactly as we have right now. It affects all countries all over the world as well. So it's a global pandemic. Another one is that it's being caused by interconnected world. So 14th century is when Europe kind of emerged from isolation, so-called isolation, after Crusades. This was the first time Europe went into the Middle East after ancient times. So that's one of the reasons that pestilence or epidemic could spread, because the world was much better connected again than in 13th and 12th century. Then differences. So we have to make sure that we understand differences between pandemic in 14th century and COVID-19. First of all, Black Death is a bacterial disease, and COVID-19 is a viral disease. So this is the major difference, and the way we deal with those diseases is completely different, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is scale. As you mentioned, pandemic in 14th century is much more severe due to first medical condition in 14th century, then hygiene. People completely didn't understand how it spreads, how it works, and
But there was no idea of germs at the time.
No.
Am I right?
No.
Yeah.
so they didn't even know how to deal with that. That's why it's called miasma. So they basically thought it's being spread by bad air. So you would be affected by being present in a miasmic environment.
Well, in a way, if you look at that, it actually makes sense, right? Because if you're
Unconsciously they were using right measures with the wrong misconceptions
it's social distancing.
worked
Yeah.
kind of in their favor. Yeah. So it's funny when we think about it that by not understanding how it works, they actually some of the measures were being correct.
Yeah.
So quarantine was being imposed in some cities in Italy, in Poland, for example. So it worked pretty well. Just to add for a few more differences. So the big difference between 14th century and now will be access to information. So people can actually look it up, look up symptoms. So it's much easier to share information about the disease, about the first symptoms, about how it spreads. So it's much easier to prevent in modern times than it was in 14th century. So that's the big difference as well. And then social support. So there was absolutely no social support. There was no government that would impose any measures in 14th century. That would be the big difference as well.
So basically, if you were a peasant somewhere out in the country, you're fucked.
You're on your own.
Okay.
So if you don't understand what's going on, 40-50% of your village is dying for some reason. There's absolutely no support. No, nobody's coming.
Well,
You're on your
if I
own.
may chip in here with the support from the government, there was support. When you look at the most affected part of Europe at the beginning was, and here is another similarity, was Italy or Italian city-states. And Italian city-states. So the city-states were ruled by city council, and there was so-called an Italian model of dealing with pestilence at the time, and there actually was a support, Michał. There was a support from the city council. The taxes were raised, so if the people were under quarantine, they were isolated. Like, let's say a family member has gotten sick. The rest of the family was locked in the house, and there was food delivered to them
For free.
Yes, this was
right.
this was a pestilence.
No,
tax.
we're talking about
raised,
the city,
ra-
right?
raised
But,
later.
That's
The
why.
question was about the countryside.
Yeah.
but-
That's why cities were the main, let's say, source of pestilence because of the density of population density. Just so this is the similarity between Black Death and COVID-19.
And
Population density is the main reason the disease spreads very easily.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
yeah, it would decimate population, the city, urban populations. But I think we should just to go back to an opening of our episode today is, as Michał mentioned before, the 14th century, before the Black Death crept in, it was hard times for people. Really hard times. We have to understand that, as Michał mentioned, the climate has changed, and there was famine and a lot of other things, wars, and then on top of that comes the Black Death, and I think this is very important and I want everyone to sink this information into your head. 60% of the population was decimated.
Of Europe.
Of Europe, whenever it went, was it in North Africa, was it Middle East, was it Far East?
If you compare it to modern times, let's say Ireland has 4 million people, right? So suddenly you have not even 2 million people living in Ireland.
Yeah.
Within 5 years, because we are only talking about 5 years. This all happened in lifespan of you can easily remember as a person, right? We are not talking about generational change, because generation change actually before population was being replenished in Europe, it took 200-300 years. So we only went back. So if you look at statistics of population density and population growth in Europe, You have steady growth till 14th century, till Black Death. Then you have a big drop, which is being maintained for 200, 300 years. So before we went back to population growth, it was 17th century.
Yeah, and in
So-
some areas, sorry for it, like in some areas, it was 19th century when pre-Black Death population level
yeah.
was reached.
Yeah.
After that,
Oh, wow. Okay.
so we are talking one of the most, if not the most significant events in the history of Europe, a Mediterranean basin, in past 1,000 years.
Yep.
And on top of that, it's very important to mention that the Black Death wasn't only mid 14th century. The Black Death was coming back to those areas for another 400 years, and the last outbreak was 1720 in Marseille, and the pestilence came, and whoever got infected was 80% death rate. So it absolutely wiped it out, and then pestilence left.
So it
So
wasn't one-off event. 14th century is also not the first time pestilence or Black Death is being introduced, let's say, to Europe, because first time it was actually 6th century in Byzantium. The people already experienced that, but because of the time span between 6th century and 14th century, nobody remembered actually what happened before, and they couldn't even associate, to be honest, because they didn't even know if it's the same disease. Because for us it's kind of let's say statistically we talk about one disease, but it had many different symptoms, and we will talk about it, that Black Death had many different symptoms, and then just like now, if you are being diagnosed with COVID-19, it's actually many different underlying issues that you could have that actually cause death, not COVID-19 itself. It was the same with Black Death as well.
Really? So it wasn't really Black Death killing people.
Not always.
Okay,
Not
not
always.
always.
As we mentioned, 14th century was affected by famine, was affected by war. So from our perspective, when you look back to 14th century, we can't we can't basically pinpoint the exact reason. In some cases, so we will kind of take it in the bracket and say, okay, 50% of that population died, but we don't really know exactly if they all died from that disease, because even if you look at archives, if you look at chronicles, they don't even talk about, like, there was no proper diagnosis, so you wouldn't even know how people died. But in some cases they would die because, let's say you had your farm where you have 10 people working on your farm, and suddenly 5 of them died. 5 of them left because they said, okay, this is the pestilence is coming to our village, we have to run away. That was the best option for you, just run away. And then suddenly you can't maintain your farm anymore, and you die of starvation within 2 weeks.
And on top of that, there was a lot of cases when people were hiding the fact that, say, a family member had Black Death and plague, because first of all, you would be under quarantine yourself.
So sorry, just jump in. So we can actually talk here about and compare it to what's happening today, the kind of a resistance against certain measures the government was implementing, right? So we have people now not wearing masks and whatever. Like, there's a lot of this, plus conspiracy theories and stuff like that. So at the time, people would have hidden the fact that the
Of
disease
course,
was coming.
if disease was on your, if you were, let's say you are a merchant city in northern Italy, like, you know, which are always really nice, well documented, kind of compact examples. If there was a pestilence on your doorstep, you would have to implement measures, and the measures immediately hit your trade and hit your craftsmen. And basically, people were hiding the fact that that there is pestilence, you know, because of economic reasons, and on the lower scale, the families wouldn't tell anyone that some member of the family has it or died from it, because number one, quarantine, number two, most of your belongings would be confiscated and burned, especially all the fabrics. Because there was this, as Michał mentioned before, there was this notion that the Black Death is transmitted through bad air, some miasmas, and all the fabrics are great places to store this bad infected air. So people decided that you're better off just burning it. So you would lose that. And quite often the body of your family member could be could undergo a autopsy, just so the doctors would make sure that that person died of plague. And people were really against it. They didn't like they. We have to remember that at the time people were extremely religious, and they really believed that if you die, you're gonna go to heaven or hell, whatever, or purgatory. But they didn't want their beloved ones remains to be desecrated. So this was extremely important reason. And now when we are talking, so there's very important kind of two tracks here. Number one is the general animosity of society towards the measures which the governments at the time were trying to implement. Being it a monarch or a city council, people were against it. People thought that the government is looking to have more power over them, to regulate
Which
them
was
more,
true.
which was true.
But sounds very familiar as well.
Yeah, look, like a couple of examples. Some trades were considered the stinky ones, right? So those were believed to cause at some stage to add to the plague, to help the plague.
Which trades? Are you talking about stinky ones? What do you mean by stinky ones?
Butchers, for example. You didn't want that, there was some sort of a help from the government, like the plague tax, and you would have your food delivered if you're under quarantine. But by the end of the day, your trade, your livelihood would be gone. So people were really against that. So that's number one. So that's a bit of not trusting the government, not thinking that they're doing the right thing. And the other track, as I mentioned, was because of the impotency of a medical profession. For the 400 years, they didn't understand it till it left Europe, till it left us alone for good. They didn't understand the reasons, which is the most important factor, and they really had trouble dealing with it.
Okay, Maciek, you were saying about kind of two tracks, and one obviously we know that the medical, knowledge in terms of medicine, comparing to today, was way different back then. Although I was quite surprised with the fact that they knew about the air and stuff like that. But if we were to dive into how the medical profession would have looked at the time of the 14th century and the plague, what would you say? Who was the doctor and how things were treated?
So first of all, any disease would be a divine intervention. So the cause is divine. The God is punishing you for something, for sins. Second of all, planet alignment, which is funny for us right now, or astrological reasons of diseases, which is still familiar to us in modern times, funny enough as well. Like after 500 years, not much has changed in that respect. So we still believe that planets can affect human life to some extent. Generally, medieval medicine was quite conservative. It was based on the theory of humors that inherited from ancient Greece, from 5th century before Christ, to be honest. And it hasn't changed till 18th century, 19th century. Theory of humors was based on four basic elements. So you have air, you have fire, you have earth, and you have water. And then also humors as being wet, being cold, being dry, and being hot, and kind of conjunction between them then reflected your character. So if with conjunction of water and cold, you will be phlegmatic, for example, right? So your character will be based on the natural elements in your body that can be intermixed or that can be interchanged, and depend on that, physician will administer medicine or will administer the way you will be treated. So it was completely different way of understanding medicine that we have at the moment. We have.
But to be honest, I'm hearing you, and I hear people that I know or see their posts on Facebook now. They seem to be believing in very similar ways of
Homeopathic medicine.
curing
Yes.
people.
Hold on a second, but it's worth mentioning that so theory of humors, obviously, it was wrong, but the general idea behind it is the balance. Okay, so if the humors were in balance, you were a healthy person. The imbalance of humors was causing a disease, and it depended in which way it shifted. That was the disease which would appear, and then the treatment would be based on, countering the humor which is too strong. But funny enough, the physiology. So the physiology is a science of a healthy body, right? It means, and everything about health is the balance.
Medieval understanding of medicine was much more nature-based than it is right now. Now we have more pharmaceutical, industrial vision of medicine. Medieval times had more natural understanding, so we were affected by different humors, like through your blood, which is wet and red, for example, and colors, and numerology, which is another part of very important part of medicine. So it depends when you were born and where you were born. This would affect you as well. So if you were born under wrong circumstances because there was the wrong planet alignment, and then the number of citizens in your village would be 25, that would be a bad omen for you. So the idea of bad omens, of numerology, of planet alignment, of divine intervention, this was all taken into account by physicians. So we didn't have a medical profession as we have now. So medical profession would consist of barbers, so they would perform surgeries, basically. And then we had physicians. Physicians would be our GP, I would say, like modern GP, who would come into your house and check you out and check your humors, draw your blood, and check your urine, for example, for any signs of disease. So that's how medicine would work in 14th century.
But what was actually surprising to me to hear that what Maciek said, that there were autopsies being done on the bodies of Black Plague victims. And I, in my head, had this idea that anatomy and study of the human body came way later.
No, it didn't. It was already there.
It was already there.
And I think it's worth mentioning that as important the medicine was at the time, for that 400 years, the one thing they were good at was diagnose. They actually, doctors could diagnose through experience. Of course, they kind of realize what are the symptoms of Black Death or the plague. Because the Black Death is a very much later term. At the time they were calling it the Great Death. We used to call it Black Death now in modern times as a
Well, the original name was actually pestilence.
pestilence.
Or plague. Like Black Death was only introduced in 18th century as a name. So they never used that name in 14th century, in medieval times.
Okay. Well, so we actually do know more or less how this was treated or wasn't treated, we should say.
No, which draws similarities to modern times as well, that we don't really understand how COVID-19 spreads and how it works. Despite all the medical advancements, we are kind of in the same situation, at least in the mental state. We are in a similar situation right now because we don't really understand how it spreads. So we take the same measures as quarantine. Quarantine was one of the main measures being used in medieval times against plague. So we actually use the same understanding at the moment, despite all the advancement.
Quarantine actually came from Italian states because the time of quarantine was 40 days, so it kind of translates into 40 days. And I think I think it's worth mentioning that the leprosy, which was prevalent in Europe just before the Great Death came over, the plague, ended. At the beginning of 14th century was the last kind of lepers around. It left Europe with a lot of facilities, leprosarium, because people at the time were being just isolated from the society. It's worth mentioning as well that there was kind of a similar but different attitude towards lepers and towards the plague. So the leper was the punishment of God for your for your personal individual sins. So this was the way it was perceived. If you were a sinner, you could become a leper as a punishment from God, while the Black Death or plague was the punishment for the whole groups of society,
Okay.
for a city, for a country, for a nation.
And
This was the prevalent notion is that it's a God's punishment, and I think it's very worth mentioning as well that the difference in between Christian and Muslim attitude towards it. So in Islam, this was the God's punishment, and you can't really do anything about it. Islam means a surrender, so you kind of surrender to the will of Allah. And what's the point running away? Like, do you think you can run away from God? You know, do you think you can just sail away somewhere and he's gonna let you go? If you were meant to have it, you're gonna have it. And later on, when the plague was coming back, and later on when Europe became divided into Catholic countries after the Reformation period, the Protestants, one of their doctrines was predestination as well. So what's gonna happen is gonna happen to you. So the Protestant part of Christianity was kind of similar to Islam when it comes to attitude towards the plague, as opposed to Catholic part, you know, where it's a punishment, but you can do something about it. And so we have, like, we go back to 14th century again. Very interesting and very kind of colorful and crazy idea of flagellants. So these were the people who went to extreme measures to repent the sins, and they're kind of like taking it for the team. So the flagellants were basically traveling from city to city and whipping themselves bloody, like really, you know, tormenting themselves in processions to please God and to ask for forgiveness and to repent for the sins of the whole community. You know, this movement of flagellants was basically, it died off in early 15th
Or it
century.
was banned by the church.
It was banned by the church as well.
Pretty
because
quickly.
Why was it banned by the church?
Because it would take over responsibility for divine, like we said, medical reasons were like divine intervention. So if you could do it yourself, it means you didn't really need a church intervention to stop it. So it was taking the privileged position of church from clergy. They were responsible for fixing it, not people who could do it themselves. So this was a very dangerous notion for the church, because if you don't need middle people between God and yourself, that's a very dangerous idea in medieval times.
Because
it's
that's
like in the company, the middle management fights for the right to exist. You know?
If the CEOs are gods, and but it was dangerous movement for church as well, for the reason that, like, can you even imagine something like that in modern times, people going like that, doing that, you know? For the medieval person at the time, it was something fascinating as well, you know, because you have this group of half-naked men just whipping themselves, and some people believe that maybe they're doing the good thing, you know, that look at them, they're like real Christians, they really repent for the sins. And what is the bishop doing?
Any heresy that denied
Structure
of the church as an institution was dangerous. So you don't need institution to believe in God,
Pope.
which is very dangerous idea again for the church as an organization.
Of course.
And then the same heresy in south of France, we have Catars in south of France, which were being completely wiped out by 14th century, by French kings. One of the reasons was that because it was a separate country, but that time, and they really wanted to incorporate it into France. And the second was that they were actually opposing Catholic Church. That's one of the reasons papacy in the beginning of 14th century, in 1309, was moved to Avignon to actually incorporate that part of France into the country.
Okay, this is a question. Probably there's no answer to that, although I don't know. I mean, we know that potentially our current epidemic that became a pandemic started with a bat, right, in China. Okay, where did Black Death come from? Do we know?
Well, you know, it came from Asia, and it affects small mammals, and it's being transmitted by fleas.
Okay.
So what happened was the Genoese merchants brought it on the ship from Crimea to Sicilian port of Messina, and they were already dying over there. There was three types of plague. One was bubonic plague, the other one was pulmonary, and the last one was septicemic. The difference is in the death ratio. So basically, it's anything in that order is about 70, 85, and the septicemic is about 95 to 99% of death rate. So you get it, you're gone. And the last one, the most severe one, from the appearance of the symptoms to your death, it was about 24 hours.
Oh wow.
So you have those three types of plague, and fleas as a transmitting agent. But it wouldn't be possible if it was only fleas transmitting that. It was also transmitted by bodily fluids, so not bad air, but your saliva, your blood.
Just to debunk common understanding, not rats, right? Fleas. So rats didn't bring it to Europe in the first place. They were brought by merchants, as we mentioned, because the trade was open with Middle East.
It's fleas riding rats who are riding the merchants' ships.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the first thing. Second thing is it's not because of poor hygiene in 14th century. Most movies would depict medieval times where people are dirty, they don't wash. That's bullshit. Okay?
Really? Is that bullshit?
Yes, it's bullshit. Absolute bullshit.
How do you know?
They were not. Well, we have so many accounts and so many documents that actually depict. One of them would be one of the best references of 14th century and Black Death itself would be Boccaccio, the Cameron, which is actually taking place during the escape from Florence during the Black Death. So that's one of the very important accounts. And any historical documents that you will read will actually prove that people were not that dirty.
So this notion of Dark Ages, of this like Monty
Yeah.
Python-esque, digging in the mud and
Yes.
teeth falling
Yeah,
out and stuff
yeah,
like
exactly,
that.
yeah.
That's all bullshit.
I mean, not all, because of course there would be big difference between cities or even countries like France and England and Italy, which were more advanced in that respect, and then Middle East, funny enough, Arabic world, what in terms of hygiene were way ahead of Europe
And
till
this still are.
17th century, yeah, at least. Some movies would go to that extent that it's just ridiculous. That people were basically shitting themselves all day, not washing, and then you would
It's
have
very exaggerated.
yeah.
Obviously, we laugh at those philosophers or doctors at the time.
I wouldn't say we laugh at Plato or Aristotle.
Yeah, but we can slag them for their ideas and say they're completely wrong. They didn't have a clue, but they really couldn't have had a clue at the time.
No, actually, when you refer to their times, they could explain many things, and it made sense, right? In their context, like if in context of 14th century. Many things explained by physicians and by theory of humors made sense. So Hippocrates and Galen being physicians in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, their ideas were still being used in medieval times and applied to that context with pretty good effect, right? They were pretty efficient to explain things that were happening in medieval times, at least to that like mental state and to that understanding.
I mean, obviously, let's not discredit some ancient school of thoughts because, as we are saying, some of them still apply, and some of the knowledge that was discovered back then is still in play. And even those alternative things that comes from Chinese medicine, they're still in play and they're being incorporated to, let's say, mainstream medicine and being applied with acupuncture and stuff like that. It's proven to be working by medics, and it's whatever 1,000 years old, right? And we can still use it. So it's not that everything was always wrong. But coming back to the 14th century, so we had humors. It was about the balance. What the doctor would do, I mean, if there was a plague, it's just quarantine, really, right? And basically that's all we can do. They wouldn't apply any herbs or anything.
No, there was ointments. There was which couldn't have worked. You know, if you read ingredients for that, it was some from grinded scorpions mixed with sulfur and mixed with
and dog's piss
yeah.
and rabbit skin or something like that.
So there was a lot of almost like magical ingredients. Probably tasted horrible and caused the reversed effect. But you could sell it for a lot of money because, you know, at the time when people have no hope, you know, you can sell them anything.
Well, yeah, that's another example. People will laugh at modern times when they refer to like 2020.
Yeah.
And they, in let's say 20, 30 years, and they realize people they were smoking weed to cure cancer, for example, right? They might laugh in 20, 30 years. They will laugh like, what was wrong with these people? Like, how can they not understand basics of biology and chemistry? Or they were using essential oils, or they were drinking water to cure themselves, or they were using any other diets to balance it.
It's similar. Like when you look at cancer now, that there is cases of charlatans who are advertising themselves that they can cure cancer using those, you know, crazy methods they develop themselves.
For example, which is very fashionable at the moment.
You
can go into a retreat for 2 weeks and pray and lie on the beach and, you know, swim in the ocean and you come back as a new person, right? So
yeah, it's
whatever works. I would say whatever works.
Yeah, this is
in the certain environment. So why do we laugh at people in 14th century that actually some of them might have been better using some of those hit and miss medicine?
Yeah. So
it might be exactly the same.
This was used a lot as well. There was obviously a lot of religious superstition with relics of saints, or so-called relics of saints from different shady characters, and it's all about the belief. And when everyone is dying around you, the hope is everything. You know, you can achieve, and someone tells you this is gonna protect you. This amulet, you know, it's Saint Sebastian's nail toe or whatever.
Saint Roch actually were used against
Saint Roch, yeah.
Mm.
The Saint Sebastian as well, I think.
Yeah, that was for people traveling as in Saint Sebastian, but then Saint Roch was used for
protection against disease.
the plague.
Yeah. So certain saints were more popular than the others. You know, you could buy tears of a saint in a little flask.
They were qualified in different aspects of
and
disease.
this will cure you. So basically, as we mentioned before, the plague came and the plague did what the plague wanted, and the plague left, right? And humans were dealing with consequences. And 10 years later, it came again, and it did what it wanted, and we were powerless.
Just like we are now.
This was happening for 400 years almost, you know. And interestingly, like the 14th century, the Great Death or the Black Death was the most powerful and the most potent. Like we were getting immunity a little bit more and a little bit more. But when it was coming and those infected were dying at the same rate as they were dying at the beginning, you know, like the last one in Marseille in 1720, the death rate was absolutely horrendous, you know. They still didn't know what to do. They still didn't understand it. So,
well, let's hope we can deal with the COVID-19 better than they did.
So all of this, what we mentioned, would raise anxiety in society, right? So the level of anxiety during the pandemic at the moment is much higher. Like it's being documented already. The same as we see in during the bubonic plague in 14th century. And then one of the another ways you could deal with that would be go on the crusade or go on the pilgrimage, right? Because church will tell you, oh, you will get plenary indulgence once you do it. And if you get plenary indulgence, your soul will be pure, which means you can deal with any disease or you can even die and go to heaven. So even if you are not getting resolution or treatment during your lifetime, that I think that's a big difference between 14th century and the mental state we have at the moment, because now we want to have it fixed right now. We want to have it fixed during our lifetime so we can improve our quality of our lives. But in 14th century, people would even accept the notion that, oh, well, you're not going to get it fixed now, but you can get it fixed when you die, right? Because you're going to go to heaven and your afterlife,
easier to live.
yeah, your afterlife will be fixed at least. So
Yeah, that's a huge difference because the way more people believed in that back in the day than they do now.
Better.
But this is what we mentioned.
Afterlife is longer than your life. It's better. It's a good
More
deal.
important.
No,
It
it's
is
not.
a
It's
good
boring.
deal.
It's boring. No, but this is this what you said now, and the important what we mentioned before, of the burial of a family members when people they were so against burying people because people were buried in mass graves. You know, people that they couldn't manage to, and you had to bury people at night. You couldn't bury them during the day. So basically, the cemeteries were full, and they were digging the holes, and they were digging mass graves and throwing people in pits. So a lot of people
which
believe,
accelerated plague again.
yeah, and a
Because
lot
they
of
were
people,
not, they were, like hygiene wasn't really maintained.
and people believe that you wouldn't go to heaven because you weren't buried properly with the proper
And you didn't
Christian
get sacraments by the
sacraments,
end
yeah,
as well.
because there was no priest. Like how could, like, it takes time, you know, for if a person dies, it takes time for that person's body to be properly ordained or properly processed in a Christian with the Christian ceremony in order to go to heaven, you know. This was all gone during the pandemic because there was basically too many bodies and too little priests, you know, to do it. So people were very concerned about that, and that's why people didn't want autopsies. They didn't want their bodies. So that's why they wouldn't tell that their relatives died of the plague, you know.
So we are talking about the Black Death and the plague and the 14th century, and we are referring it as all our podcasts to modern times and to today. And obviously, we all wonder what is going to happen, whether there will be any shift within the society that we live in, and I wonder if we can draw any comparisons and see what happened after the Black Plague. I know there was a few of them, but we focus on the 14th century. And how did the society then shifted and what changes became apparent? And probably maybe we can actually figure out what can happen to us as well looking back at the history.
Yeah, so 14th century is basically a time of change. It's like the world is changing. For people living in 14th century, the world is changing. Like we mentioned, so many different events and calamitous events even happened in 14th century. So people observing and living it in that times, they would be to some extent aware that this is like a special environment or a special time they live in. And so consequences, not to say that Black Death or any epidemic that happened in 14th century or any of the events that we mentioned before is the reason that there were so many changes in society. Rather, it kind of highlighted the social issues, so social inequality. People could actually see what we mentioned before, that the peasants suddenly get more attention. They felt more self-aware, I would say, about their social inequality, and they really wanted to change. So there was a big movement to actually change that social inequality that stemmed from feudal society. So here we have first symptoms of modernity, first symptoms of capitalism, especially in Italy. Renaissance in Italy starts already in the end of 14th century and beginning of 15th century. These are the first symptoms of Renaissance, of change in culture. So it's not really that any of these events can be associated with the reason that this happened. It's rather all these events can reinforce, they can kind of highlight issues in society in 14th century. But if we talk about consequences of Black Death, I think it's important to mention now that radicalization, so the similarities between 14th century and now we could identify is radicalizations, like social radicalization. So you have, as Maciek mentioned, we have flagellants, we have heretical movements, we have social uprisings in Europe that never happened before. We have Jacquerie in France during 100 Years' War. That's the middle of 14th century. Jacques, by the way, were peasants. The same movement in England in 1381. We have huge peasant uprising. Actually, peasants are marching to London. They decapitated the head of state. They decapitated the bishop. They only spared the king, who hid himself in the Tower of London. And so it's a big movement against the feudal structure. It's an amazing precedent in medieval times. It never happened before to that scale. Of
Okay,
course.
well, that's a consequence. It's a super interesting consequence. But why Black Death caused that? Why the Black Death caused the uprising against the power?
One of the reasons is you have destruction of social structure in terms of who works and who is using that work, right? So many peasants died during the pestilence. Farms are being abandoned. There's much easier movement within the society. So people are moving to cities because there's many people dying in cities as well, and then you have bigger chance to actually find a job or start any job in the city. So now you have kind of social turmoil where social structures that we saw existed in feudal society are being diminished.
There's more land available. People who survived the pestilence, a lot of them were kind of better off, because if you had a farm, if you're a son of a farmer and you had a couple of brothers and everyone died, and all of a sudden you're left with the farm on your own, you don't have to share it. There was not enough people to work, so the labor, the wages went up.
Yeah.
Because so the social movement, there was a lot of social movement, to the point that even some of the lords in few countries issued laws against, they called it a frivolous dressing, or people from lower classes dressing in the way,
pretending to be higher state,
because they could afford it at some point. The goods were cheaper. There was more. They were being paid more for the labor because there was not enough people. They started owning more land because they inherited from their family who died off during the.
Or you can basically take over land. Just as a good reference, there's a movie called Black Death from 2010, directed by Christopher Smith. I think this is, despite being not very historically accurate, I think it kind of shows the notion what really happened. It's based in England. What really happened during Black Death, when you had you could basically come across abandoned land and take over, and it was yours. So people who were poor suddenly, because of labor cost, suddenly became important. So their kind of confidence is rising in the social strata. Now they become more important, and they understand that. So now they think, oh, we can actually affect economy, we can affect politics to some extent. That's why we have the peasant uprisings in England, in France.
Against the government to gain what?
More rights.
Importance, more rights.
Okay.
So all over Europe, it's not a coincidence that we have the same kind of revolts all over Europe. That's one of the main consequences of pestilence.
Like, look, when you look through the whole history of mankind, people at power want to keep that power. So usually they're against change. And all of a sudden they see the biggest change they have ever seen, recorded, heard of during their lifetime, So they were so against it. It's important as well to say about the church, because church, the number of parish priests dropped by 50%. They died as well. They, the holy water wouldn't protect them against it. So before a plague, there was the parish priest usually would be actually fairly well educated and experienced, and all of a sudden they had to be replaced with new blood. There was no time to educate them as well as they were educated before. They didn't have that much experience. They were way younger, but it opens a roads to career for peasants as well. If you're a bright young fellow, you could become a priest. And that's a career opportunity for you. Yeah, of course, it means money. It's privilege. It means relative safeness as well. So safety, sorry. So this is another huge change. So we see a massive social economic change in Europe in 14th century.
And we believe it might happen right now as well. So that's one of the similarities we can see. That's why of the reasons we talk about it, because I believe this is the same kind of notion in Europe or in the world at the moment. We have much more turbulent social environment, I would say, and we can see that for maybe for different reasons, maybe not only economically, not only politically, but there is radicalization. We can see it for the last 4 or 5 years. There is a radicalization. To the same extent, I think we can draw comparisons with modern times. Probably COVID-19 will highlight the same issues and can lead to some kind of revolution or evolution in society. We can probably identify the same issues at the moment. So we have, similarly to 14th century, we have big social inequality, right? It's more, I would say, economical at the moment, more political. As we mentioned before, it's more to do with power or access to knowledge, which in turn is power. Another comparison I would find is changes within spiritual dimension. So as we mentioned, crisis of the church. So we talked about great papal schism that ran for 70 years in 14th century, and then this was the first symptom of crisis in the church as an institution, and all the heresies and then later on witch hunt were also symptoms. They highlight issues that exist already within society.
Mm-hmm. So the Black Death, could we say, was a trigger in a way, or not really? It was just, no, it must have been connected in a way. I mean, it's
more like a wake-up call. When you think about COVID-19, it's probably like a wake-up call for society. Something is wrong. Like, do we manage? Something is basically wrong with economy we live in. Something is wrong with society we live in. If something like that with this high level of medicine and hygiene and control is happening, it means that this is kind of a symptom of big issues that exist. We don't really realize on a daily basis, but they basically exist in our society. And this is kind of how we can observe it. This is something that will highlight those issues even more, because every extreme circumstances will actually show you that all the differences and on all the issues to a much higher extent.
Well, so in a way, the 14th century was the beginning of the capitalism and ending of feudalism. I'm full of hope. Probably we can't discuss it really. I'm full of hope that greedy capitalism is going to be over after this pandemic, and that it will be a wake-up call for societies. But what about culture? Like, how did it reflect in culture, the Black Death and the whole plague? I mean,
I would like to chip into the previous question before we jump into. So there's the massive difference here we see is obviously that the plague caused the population, which COVID-19 isn't. You know, and that for me is the main difference. You know, you have an event which is wiping out 60% of the world population, and now we know that it's nothing.
It's more like inconvenience.
Yeah, it's more like inconvenience
than really life-threatening event, right?
Exactly.
For majority of people.
So with the plague, we have plague as a, I wouldn't call it a domino effect, but what Michał mentioned, depopulation made it possible for those changes, which were kind of brewing anyway. Yeah. But it would take a way longer for them to occur without the population. Yeah. So it caused the chain of effects. It
accelerated the events.
On every level, from social level, economic level, through religious level, spanned in centuries. And I think it really accelerated changes in Europe. While with the COVID-19, the similarity obviously is that it's a global event, so it basically affects the whole world.
We're entering. Sorry to interrupt you. We're entering very sticky ground, because you mentioned the word depopulation a couple of times. and I think I saw a couple of conspiracy theories saying that the COVID-19 is an event that is to lead to the population through vaccines.
Ah, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So
No,
you're
okay.
saying that
Okay,
the
we'll get it.
population helped the world progress.
It did.
So I'm kind of thinking maybe
It did.
Bill
Look.
Gates won't know something.
Look,
actually.
Kami, okay, all right. You have to sometimes, you have to look at those events and forget about morality and forget about human laws and just look at the effects, right? Is it helping the humanity or civilization as a whole, or is it not? And obviously, this was an accelerating factor. But now with COVID-19, what I see is that a lot of people, especially during the period of lockdown, which is kind of easing off now, I think a lot of people kind of re-evaluated in their heads what is really important in their life. And I think that the things like time spent with your family, the time you can spend with yourself, obviously you weren't able to do a lot of things, but there were things you could actually do you never have time for. Like you could read so many books, you could watch interesting films, you can spend a mindful time with your loved ones, have a deep meaningful conversations, and admire nature. I think it will somehow change, not all of us, not majority of us, but a lot of people, will kind of go, okay, maybe money, maybe career is not the most important thing in my life. Maybe rather than earning extra couple of £100, it's better to go camping with my...
Which in turn can affect economy as well when we start thinking about jobs in a different way. For example, the whole idea of universal basic income, where government will lend you money and you can kind of spend this money in the way you like, and then definition of jobs will change as well. And previous generation would never imagine being without jobs because it defines you as a citizen of a country. When you pay taxes, this is changing as well. This notion is absolutely reversed.
I think, especially in America, isn't it? Like what's your name and what do you do for a living is the follow-up question.
But now, if you look at the next generation, it's completely reversed. Like it's becoming completely different spectrum. And then going back to 14th century again, let's say spiritual changes and how it leads to conspiracy theories. We mentioned Trial of Templars by Philippe the Fair in France. This was economical event, right? He wanted to raise money for the next war with England. That was the main reason he kind of went after Templars, because they had so much money they accumulated in the Middle East. They had so much lands they accumulated in France by, that he gave them initially anyway, just like church. So he went after church as well. So this was like big economical event. I don't want to go into details in that respect.
It all happened before Black Death war.
So this is beginning of 14th century. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we look at 14th century, we are still talking about 100 years span, right? When you think and when you compare it to modern times, we should compare it to 20th century. When you look from this perspective, 20th century is quite calamitous as well, at least the beginning.
When you think about
two world wars, Cold War. That's why book of Barbara Tuchman that we used as a reference for this podcast. That's why when she wrote in 70s, for her this was equivalent of 14th century in terms of calamity, because in 70s Cold War and nuclear war was a real threat. For us, it's just an event that our parents would mention sometimes, or we read in books, or we watch in movies. But for them, it was a real threat. Like they didn't know what's going to happen within 10 years.
Well, it's worth mentioning that our generation, like we still, like I'm 41, I was still taught in school how to behave during it was kind of like a military training. How to behave in case of nuclear attack. So. But for people, even I think 10 years younger than me, that's history. That's past. The nuclear threat now is some madman who's gonna, like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. okay, he may have a nuke, he can fire it up, but once he's doing that, the whole country is wiped out in a matter of 10 minutes.
Yeah.
You know, so the big Armageddon of nuclear war between Soviet Union and US, that's history, right?
Yeah. So the same way we look at 14th century with symptoms of crisis, symptoms of change, we have the same symptoms right now, but we might not understand, or we might not take them into account to actually use it as a reference point for the same causality or the same effects. Another point, like you ask what would be the impact on culture. Why do we believe that there's something else, like we mentioned about trying to understand conspiracy theories? Why does it have to be intentional? Why do we have to always refer to things that happened as associated with somebody's name, or there's a reason behind it, or there's somebody had to put it in motion, because otherwise we can't identify the reasons for something happening.
I mean, I think throughout humanity, we always tried to find answers and explain to ourselves the world around us, and it's really simple scenarios of black and white. And
just to show, because I didn't really explain what I was trying to say. Where is the comparison? Where is the link between supernatural world in 14th century and supernatural understanding in modern times? So the link here is where we believe that there's something else than humans that can actually affect our lives. And I think this is already happening in culture for a long time. So crisis in economy, crisis in terms of big disparity in social strata, right? We have very high level of social inequality at the moment, much higher than 20, 30 years ago.
Higher than ever.
And it's already confirmed, which impacts economy. And now in that situation, to draw a comparison with 14th century again, people back then would turn to church, would turn to their spiritual beliefs. But now, I think it's kind of trickled down to everyday culture through a belief in superhumans or supernatural, not in the religious sense, but in the cultural sense. Did you notice a much higher level and increase of fantasy movies, science fiction movies?
Of course it did, yeah.
In culture, everything to do with non-explained events, UFO sightings, looking for alien life.
I don't know. I've definitely noticed more superhero movies around.
I'm so happy you actually mentioned superhero movies, because when we were talking earlier on about the 60% people that died during the Black Plague, I don't know much about superhero movies, but there's Marvel film, this series,
Avengers,
Avengers,
Endgame,
and there was an event like that where you
Thanos?
know a lot of people disappeared.
50% of every living
so
form
I was kind of thinking
in the
about Black
universe
Plague
disappeared.
compared to
Yeah,
that,
that's exactly what it was.
That would be actually good reference. So it's not coming from nowhere. It is based in some kind of cultural reference, and I believe to some extent that we are actually witnessing social changes. We just don't understand them yet, but I think they're happening, and COVID-19 is one of the symptoms. COVID-19 is not the reason something will change. It's just one of the symptoms. We will look at it probably at the same as we look at 14th century. So there were so many events, so many calamitous events in 14th century, and now when we look at end of 20th century or beginning of 21st century, we will have the same reference point and say, okay, this events happened which kind of reinforced social changes that led to something else.
It's quite. I'm not saying no. It's quite possible. I think COVID-19 is not. It's in no way, shape, or form will be as powerful catalyzer as plague was, because it's not. It's nowhere near that potent. But at the same time, the modern world is so interconnected that every change, everything is happening.
So the
almost instant,
and the butterfly effect is even more enhanced
exactly,
in that environment.
Yeah,
and that's exactly why I.
So maybe we don't need another
We don't
Black
need
Death
much.
wiping out half of the population.
Exactly.
Maybe we just need this kind of. Okay, let's.
Very very minute trigger.
Yes, it's a mild.
But we don't even notice.
Disease in a way. When you look at what happened in the history of the world and all the pandemics, so the Black Death, the smallpox in Americas, the syphilis, the Spanish flu in the beginning of 20th century. Those were real killers, and now we have something much more moderate and mild, but at the same time being on a global level and affecting basically every country in the world, you know. And because the way we are interconnected now, every change is happening much faster. We are like everything is happening faster. Everything, like we mentioned it before, everything is more, everything is faster, everything is almost instant. So I'm not saying no. It might happen. Yeah, we just don't see it now, or maybe some smart people see it already and they are writing papers on that.
I mean, it's changing now. Our life is changing. People around me, their life is changing, and as you said, the outlook of people in what's important, why it's important, and stuff like that. This is changing. My hope is that it's gonna be on a much bigger scale than only people that I know. That will basically join the evolution and go and try and decrease those inequalities and basically even the world out just thanks to that. And I think it's a trigger, even though the plague was more potent as a disease. COVID-19 lives in way more potent times of interconnection.
And maybe we will see that in 10 years, like we can see going back to 14th century, we can see that in writings of Boccaccio, let's say, or Petrarch, or Hieronymus Bosch, who was actually painting, his famous paintings were the beginning of 15th century, but they kind of reflected the mood. You can see in his paintings, like most of them are related to end of the world or the last judgment or apocalypse, right? So there was a mood kind of that reflected all those changes that were happening in their eyes, that led to Renaissance, that led to New World Order, I would say, in that respect. So you can see that being reflected in culture already. Maybe we don't see it at the moment. Maybe superhero movies are equivalent of that, of Hieronymus Bosch. You never know. Maybe that's how it's being translated to us through culture at the moment. That's a supernatural dimension, which is more like than religious in medieval times.
I must say that now I got the whole monologue that you had. Now I got it. Yeah, it is an interesting thing. Whether we will be able to see it at all, but if someone in 50, 100 or 20 years time looks at cinemas, at the films that were created now,
more like say, 10.
It's COVID there, guys.
More like 10 years. More like 10 years.
Yeah, cool.
We have to mention now an extreme difference between the 14th century and later on plague and what we have now. There was no person in medieval times who doubt that the existence of plague. There was no merchant sitting in a tavern and elbowing each other like, what do you think about this whole plague?
Do you believe in plague?
Do you believe in plague? Because I think it's a hoax. It's a bullshit. It's just the city council wants to control and wants us to pay more taxes. No, this didn't happen. There was no person who wouldn't believe in that. Because for obvious reasons. If you were living at the time, half of people you knew dropped dead. So no one ever questioned that.
We can say it was divine, right? It was coming from God.
Of course it was.
That's one thing, but
it's a punishment.
Yeah, that's one thing, but also even now, the understanding is different through experience, right? So if it doesn't affect you personally, or if it doesn't affect anybody that you know, you are highly unlikely to believe in a big story. That's a simple explanation I would find. So if it's not individual, it's very difficult to accept. Once you are being affected through experience, then it's a different story.
If you know people,
you suddenly believe that.
Yeah, I had this very conversation with a random person who started talking about pandemic now, and he said, "Do you even believe in the virus?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do. I know 5 people who got it confirmed, and I know 1 person who died." And this was the response to that person saying that he doesn't know anyone who has it. And after I said it was kind of like a moment of silence, because I don't think he was expecting that kind of answer. So But exactly what Michał said, you know, if it affects your life, if it affects you personally, you're more likely to believe in it and to comply with government's regulations. But if it doesn't, you know, you kind of, after of 4 or 5 months of a lockdown, you kind of go like, you know, this is bullshit.
Yeah, denial is always linked to
it's-
abstract thinking, right? If it's really abstract, if it's really something you share online, then you have your reasons to doubt it. You have your reasons to question it.
They all saw there was Black Plague, but they didn't blame any secret society to bring it on. It was just a God's thing.
Yeah, and Jews, obviously, you know.
But then Jews.
Yeah, blame the Jew, you know. It's like,
For what? What did they do?
they poisoned the wells, obviously, you know.
Yeah, they were eating children.
That's well-known fact that they were poisoning Christian wells
And eating children.
Yeah,
using their blood for their for matzah, which is the bread.
I mentioned already radicalization, like social radicalization. One of the symptoms of that radicalization would be Jewish pogroms. So, in times of uncertainty, in times of social difficulties, let's say, you look for scapegoats, right? You look for someone to blame. So, obvious social group in medieval times would be Jewish, because they never fit in to any society. They deal with money that Christianity forbids.
They killed our Lord Jesus.
That's another reason.
It was written in a book. I've heard of a book that has that.
Yeah.
Look somewhere. Yeah.
Look, it's always the Jews, you know.
No,
so-
but it's
yeah, no, but okay, we are having fun now, but it wasn't funny at the time. But what Michał said, like, you know, you look for a scapegoat, and what better scapegoat than the society which is isolated, which is different,
Which is rich as well for reasons most people don't understand.
But any other theories that were circling around? Any other conspiracies that were happening within that time?
So, psychology of conspiracy is really interesting to some extent, because when you think why would people believe that something they see on a daily life is not true, and there's some secret society or there's something more going on. So equivalent of that divine intervention that we see in medieval times would be conspiracies in our times, right? Because that would be kind of the same thinking that we have right now. Because in conspiracies, one of the main elements is intentional thinking, that things cannot happen on itself.
Nothing happens by chance.
Yeah.
That's
So-
the main mechanism behind it. There has to be a reason and a bigger picture and a
It's
hidden
called-
agenda.
Well,
It's
we
called-
need that as a people. Like you have to have a reason why we exist. So anything
You have to
starts with that, right?
personalize something. So you
Yeah.
have to either blame someone for something, like we were talking about looking for a scapegoat, or you have personalize something that happens around you or identify something, because we cannot accept chaos as human beings. We cannot accept that things happen by chance. So this is called dispositional explanation. It always needs either identifiable reason, or it needs someone behind, like you said, Bill Gates or Elon Musk. Somebody triggered something.
No.
Somebody started a movement, and then
I'm
this is
sorry.
the consequence.
It's not Musk. It's not Bill Gates. You know, it's the reptilians.
Reptilians, or or any other secret societies.
I'd say Gates and Musk could be working for them. But there is always someone. I sometimes wonder, you know, being Bill Gates and sitting at home looking at his beautiful Windows computer and reading these messages, thinking, wow, like, you know, this must be amazing and scary, and actually probably also sad, because the guy is a philanthrope as well, to see that he's responsible for so many deaths. We'll see what happens with this viral pandemic that we have now, and how it's going to change our world. Well, I do hope it's going to change the world for the better, and hope that's all I have. Guys, thank you so much for today. We are going to wrap it up now, but we'll talk to you again soon.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.